Thank you, Madam President. Women and men of the Senate. In 1820, the state of Maine entered the nation as a free country, a free state. And since that time, Maine has had a very strong history of what I'll just call abolitionism. It is a people that honors freedom and civil liberty and the dignity and worth of every human personality. And I'm going to take us back just for a minute to read a law that the state of Maine passed in 1855, which was 5 years after the second version of the Fugitive Slave Act passed. It was Public Law Chapter 182, an act to further protect personal liberty. And it's short, and it just encapsulated the values of the people of the state of Maine at the time. Being enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives and legislature assembled as follows. Section 1, no judge of any court in this state and no justice of the peace shall hereafter take cognizance of or grant a certificate in cases arising under the Act of Congress passed September 18, 1850, or the act to which that was additionally entitled, quote, an act respecting fugitives from justice, end quote, to any person who claims any other person as a fugitive slave within the jurisdiction of this state. Section 2. No sheriff, deputy sheriff, coroner, constable, jailer, or other officer of this state in his official capacity shall hereafter arrest or detain or aid in arresting or detaining in any prison or building belonging to this state or any county, city, or town thereof of any person by reason of his being claimed as a fugitive slave. I'll interject here. Slaves were not citizens of this country at the time, and many were considered dangerous. Section 3. This is the most interesting part. Any justice of the peace, sheriff, deputy sheriff, coroner, constable, or jailer, who shall in his official capacity directly or indirectly offend against the provisions of this act or aid and abet any person claiming any other person as a fugitive slave in the arrest and detention of such person so claimed as a fugitive slave shall forfeit a sum not exceeding $1,000 for such offense to the use of the county where said offense is committed, or shall be subject to imprisonment not exceeding 1 year in the county jail. So the state of Maine said, we're going to put you in jail if you participate in the Fugitive Slave Act in the state of Maine. This was a nullification like I've never seen, because it actually penalized a sheriff, a deputy sheriff, a coroner, a constable, or a jailer who went against this law. And then Section 4 simply says, nothing in this act shall be construed to hinder or obstruct the Marshal of the United States, federal official, his deputy, or any officer of the United States from executing or enforcing the laws of the United States referred to in the first section of this act, also known as the Fugitive Slave Act, approved March 17, 1855. I found this in 2019 as I prepared to present a bill to the Judiciary Committee called An Act to Protect the Liberty of Asylum Seekers and Refugees in Maine, which basically, in its body, was the bill in front of us here. At the time, Madam President, women and men of the Senate, it didn't seem wise to have a floor debate on such a divisive issue, and so we convinced the presiding officers at the time to keep those bills in committee to die. Clearly, today, these bills were not kept in committee to die because they are in front of us now. This one in particular for enactment. I'm going to read the first section of a new section of Chapter 337E, which this bill seeks to enact. And I won't comment on anything that the good sheriff from Cumberland said or anything from the good United States Senator's office. But this is the first thing that this new chapter says after the definition section. This chapter may not be construed to prohibit a law enforcement agency from sending to or requesting or receiving from an immigration authority information regarding the immigration status of a person or maintaining or exchanging that information with any other federal, state, or local governmental entity under 8 United States Code Section 1373 or 1644. So right there, we can cooperate. Our law enforcement officers can cooperate. 2, the chapter may not be construed to prohibit a law enforcement agency from investigating, lawfully detaining, executing a criminal warrant, or taking other action against a person pursuant to state criminal law or federal law as provided in section 4763, subsection 2, some of which the good senator from Oxford read into the record. But then there's a final section. There are 2 other sections, but the one I'll read is 4764, duties of custodial law enforcement agencies. A law enforcement agency shall, for an inmate in the agency's custody, in advance of an interview between the inmate and the immigration authority regarding a civil immigration violation, provide the inmate with a written consent form that explains the purpose of the interview, that the interview is voluntary, and that the inmate may decline the interview or be interviewed only with the inmate's attorney present. The consent form must be written in the primary language of the inmate and read to the inmate by a person who is not an immigration authority. This paragraph does not establish a right of counsel that otherwise does not exist in law. And 2, upon receiving a hold request, provide a copy of the request to the inmate and inform the inmate that the law enforcement agency is prohibited under section 4763 from detaining an inmate based solely on the hold request. The plain language of what I have read suggests to me, who knows a little something about this law because I presented it once, that we are not prohibiting law enforcement authorities in our state from cooperating with federal law enforcement in its duty to keep us safe by making sure that criminals are prosecuted and those who are not here legally may be detained and deported. But what we have learned, both here in Maine and elsewhere, all of this is due process. Everything that I just read is called due process. The state of Maine isn't going back to the Fugitive Slave Act and saying if you do these things outside of this law, you will be punished by a fine or imprisonment. No, no. None of that. We're not doing that right now. What we are saying, though, is when you do cooperate, when you do hold someone, you just have to follow due process as we've laid forth in this statute. I come from a community, one of 2, as you may have read in the paper, that applied for what we call a training application with ICE in order for our law enforcement officials in our community to more freely cooperate, if you will, with law enforcement agencies. Our chief of police held a public forum on that. The people in our community showed up en masse and asked him not to go forward with that application. And one of the reasons why they asked him not to go forward with that application, because an example was given where law enforcement officers could not verify the citizenship of 4 people who were migrant workers, could not verify whether or not their international driver's license were in fact valid. I don't know if they were or weren't. But on that alone, and for no other reason, local law enforcement called ICE. And the people in my community were outraged by that. And thankfully, because our chief of police is such a good man, said, I do not want to divide my community, and so I will withdraw our application for this particular program. But the reason why he wanted it was because he knew that his law enforcement officers needed training, precisely so that our town, our surrounding towns, would not feel as though we would be on the hook for a lawsuit that could come if in fact someone did not follow the letter of the law and do the right thing by the people who were being detained and or arrested and or investigated for being here illegally or not. But the thing that was chilling, Madam President, women and men of the Senate, was an admission that if we cannot prove your citizenship, we will call ICE on you. That chilled me to the bone. And so since then, With no disrespect to anyone here or my chief of police, I now carry my U.S. passport card with me at all times. We know people have been disappeared without due process. We know people have been detained without due process. We know people have been deported to prisons in other countries without due process. And so what this bill does is it creates guardrails here in the state of Maine, a place that has a long tradition of freedom and abolition, and that is what it does. And so if anybody interprets this in any other way, I suppose that is fine. But what I see this as, we are outlining due process, because we're in a real situation that we were not in 2019. As the good senator from Penobscot, my seatmate of my seatmate, said the other day, I would be inclined to go with my Republican colleagues on opposing this bill in a different time. But we are in the moment, and there is no turning back, women and men of the Senate. And so for me, this bill is not dangerous. This bill respects the tradition of the people who came before us in these chambers, who nullified the Fugitive Slave Act, and we're not going anywhere near that with this legislation. And so I will have no problem voting for this bill come hell or high water, death threats or not. It is what it is. And it is my honor to see the bill sponsor of this legislation sitting right here in the gallery today, who is closing the loop on something I started in 2019 when it wasn't exactly necessary, but now it is. And so I support this legislation. I do not think it's dangerous, and I do believe that it upholds the values of the people of the state of Maine that came before us. Thank you, Madam President, women and men of the Senate.